It's my great pleasure to introduce Barb Hunt. You know, I was trying to remember when we first met, and it might have been in Montreal. Was it Montreal, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's Montreal.
It was Montreal. Okay. That's just a personal aside, excuse me. But anyways, I'll segue. I'll use that as a segue because Barb did do her Master's of Fine Arts at Concordia University, and you're from Winnipeg, really.
Yes.
And so you did your undergraduate work at the University of Manitoba. Barb is, can I call you a fiber artist?
You can call me whatever you want. I'm not worried about labels.
I won't call you a fiber artist, but I know you as being, you know, that your practice is very much concerned with fibers and using fibers, not only because you probably love them, but as a kind of a political gesture as well, right? And so that's what I think, part of what makes you very interesting and important person here in Canada, especially as an artist, that you were kind of pioneering that kind of use of materials for a certain, that the material meant something in itself, right? Barb has been in a great many shows. Your CV is many pages long, and I had a hard time cutting it down to the most succinct things, but I did manage to a little bit. You've been in shows in St. John's, in a show at the Rooms, another show at the Macintosh Gallery in Western Ontario, Anti-Personnel. You've done a number of shows in England, and there was one down here in 1987 at Plug-In called Never Trust a Hippie.
I have a picture.
So maybe we'll want to see something about that. And you've been written up in oodles and oodles of reviews and anthologies, books. Most recently, Anthea Black did a book called Craft Hand, Dye-Free, Radical Curatorial Strategies of Craft in Unruly Spaces, so that's kind of cool. And you were in another book, also by Anthea Black, or what? Because I've got two entries here.
She and Nicole Burrish had wrote the essay, and it was in 2 books. And the other one was Glenn Adamson's book about craft, I think.
Yes, okay, yes, right.
They told me they had to edit the 2 a little bit differently.
You're in 2 books, that's very good.
My CV.
Renee Barth has written on you, and Joan Borsa has wrote a chapter called Obsession Compulsion. Was that, no, The Ephemeral Collection was the title of your chapter in the book put together by Anthony Kendall called Obsession Compulsion. And also in a book by the name of Collection from Banff, the Banff Press? Or do I just have this wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, right, because I put my own bullets here and I'm all mixed up. Excuse me. Just before I give Barb the floor, I just wanted to read you a paragraph that you've got on your website that I thought was quite beautiful. And you've labeled it as your artist statement, but it's a bit of biography, and I think it's quite interesting, and it sort of gives a nice insight into where you're coming from. Barb writes, there are close ties between Newfoundland and the islands of Ireland and England. And as a descendant of Irish-English pioneers, I was taught some of the textile skills expected of women. Living in Newfoundland with its rich tradition of textile practices has inspired me to return to these processes and materials in my art and research. My work over the past years has focused on the rituals of death and mourning, particularly those of Newfoundland. The repetitive nature of textile work seems to be a common way of coping with grief and loss, and this becomes a metaphor for protecting and healing. I'm currently working with camouflage fabric and used army fatigues to make statements about the devastation of war. And in my art practice, I attempt to mend separations, reveal and recuperate the feminine, which historically has been discredited. And by giving value to the humble, the discarded, and the handmade, I hope to recover lost histories, encourage the reconstruction of traditional rituals within a contemporary context. I give you Barb.
Thank you, Marcus. Hi, everybody. Where do I start now? Start at the beginning. This is a marriage quilt. My grandmother Hunt made marriage quilts for all the grandchildren. And this is mine. They were meant for display more than they were meant for use, which puts the lie to quilts as craft. I consider them to be an art form. And I, as you mentioned, I come from, I'm the great-granddaughter of Irish pioneers. That's pretty close, isn't it? Great-granddaughter. It's close in history. So this is the very first piece I did as a student at University of Manitoba. And our sculpture instructor wanted us the whole class to have pieces that went right through the floodway. So this is a soft, like a big soft round thread, except that it's probably about 1.5 foot in diameter and very long. It's made from the sheets of my best friend's dead grandfather, which I dyed pink. So it has in the very first piece I did when I went to school, it has all the concerns of my work right through my career, which is interesting. It's kind of like we keep repeating the same themes. And I've structured the slideshow to show you how an artist keeps repeating the same themes and working with the same issues. Although this was in 1970, I went to art school 78 to 82, and in those days you didn't use fabric or textiles. I tried and I got made fun of by my sculpture professor. He just walked around the studio and made fun of this work, and he called my work pretty and tabletop sculpture. It was really, those were insulting words. So I stuck to the hard stuff. This is a life-size hollow cast concrete sculpture of a man that I did. I hired the model and Barton. After school, I lived in my studio in Winnipeg. When you're an artist, I always suggest just do whatever it takes to make sure that you can do your art. So for me, it was living in my studio. I lived up here where those 3 windows are, right on Main Street in Winnipeg. Anybody here from Winnipeg? Who's Winnipeggers? Yeah, sort of, yes. Sort of. Yeah. I wasn't born there, but I lived there the biggest part of my life and love it more than any other place in the world. So that was kind of a rough life, but I loved it. This is the inside of my studio. It was an office, and I tore out a wall, and I lived there illegally, and we were trying to make our spaces legal, so Larry Glosson took pictures of us in the space. So, I can use my red dot. That's where I slept, and then in this little room, that's where I had a table where I could eat and work, and then this was my studio. And there's broken glass on the floor, which you'll see in a work soon. This is my second solo show, but the first kind of big one at Plug-In Gallery. And it's the one that's called Never Trust a Hippie. I am an old hippie, right? But I was working, and I really believe the day jobs that we have to support ourselves as artists can contribute to your art practice. And I was working at a harvest collective, and there were lots of old hippies, and I just thought, oh my God, I'd forgotten. So these are, this is the cowboy hippie. He's kind of like macho and arrogant. This is the teacher. When I went to school, I had all male teachers in art school, and naturally had a lot of trouble, and got into a lot of trouble. And I just really, full of resentment, so I put that all into this teacher figure. This is the guru. This is the big old hippie lady that always wants to give you a cup of tea, and she thinks, give you a cup of tea, everything will be all right. Of course, that's what I do now with my students. Come into my office, I'll give you a cup of tea, everything will be all right. So I burned them. I couldn't get anybody, after Plug-In, I couldn't get anybody in Canada to show them the old hippies. And it was kind of like a self-portrait and being critical of my own past. I realized that later. I thought I was being critical of all those people, and I realized, no, it's, this is work about me, it's about my past. So another show was called Shrapnel, and it was about relations between men and women, and this is where I kind of got interested in ideas of the feminine and the masculine, which is really very confusing and still confuses me. But I do believe that values that we label feminine are values that are really needed in our world. So I try to kind of aggrandize things that are feminine in my work. This is another life-size figure I did of myself. It's fabric, don't do this. It's fabric dipped in urethane. Urethane is really toxic. I used toxic materials when I was a young artist. And I tell my students, I can't believe I'm still vertical. So yes, the reason you don't want to use urethane in any of your projects is that after a few years it turns yellow. So this is green now. And there's the broken glass in there. So it's a woman in a bed with made out of broken glass that's embedded into the bed. So a lot of it is about pain and difficulty and wrenching things. And you can see the fabric there. This is the show where I really started to use fabric. So I went to Banff in 1989-90, and my studio was this one up here. I'll tell you the truth, because you're students, and I try to tell students the truth. And that is that when I went to Banff, I'm naturally a kind of shy person. And when I went to Banff, I checked out all the studios ahead of time, and I really wanted that corner studio. I wanted a studio with light, and I thought, how am I going to get this studio? So the next day, because I knew I wouldn't be able to fight people for it. I'm a good fighter in some situations, but not in a situation with a group of artists. And so I noticed that there were stairs going down the inside building that went straight down to the basement, and that's where the dye room was. So I told everybody I was a textile artist and that I would be lugging buckets of wet dyed fabric up and down the stairs. And they said, oh, well, in that case, you can have this studio. So I went into the studio, and then I thought, what have I done? Now I've got to do textile art for a whole year. But very, very luckily, Ruth Schuing and Neil McInnes were there, two amazing textile artists. And it was where I found out that working with textiles can be art all by itself. And I was just the happiest camper in the world, and that's one of my pieces here. Very, very happy. So this is what the studio looked like. I spent a whole year just experimenting with textiles, with the fabric and the material, and trying to find ways of imparting emotion or getting emotion to be expressed through the use of fabric and dye. So I had a wonderful year, hardly made any finished pieces, but I think this is really good to do as an artist, is give yourself some time, give yourself a residency, and just play. So much fun. And after that, I was dreadfully poor and went tree planting. And I put this in, and the slide of me working as a carpenter's assistant with my brother, just to make the point that just do anything you can when you're an artist. So just think of it as a day job, just think of it, this is how I'm getting money for my studio practice, so whatever it takes. Then I did my MFA at Concordia, which I'm very happy about. Concordia is downtown Montreal. The program is kind of political, streetwise, lots of support for feminism. Of course, this is back in the 90s. I mean, I don't know what it's like there now. I know it's
always shifting, eh?
Is it towards what?
Well, now in text, of course it still is that. But now they're calling it a materials practice.
Materials.
They're trying to expand the definition from the fibers area.
Oh, okay. So now I'm a materials practitioner. Sounds like a doctor. How do you fix your materials? Anyway, I was working, still obsessed and fascinated by the constructions. I learned Femininity and Masculinity. It's a construction. It's not something, we're not born feminine or masculine. We're made that way by the culture we live in. And so I tried to show the strength and power of femininity, and I did it through using the strongest material I could find, which is steel. This is cold rolled steel, so it has a really nice feeling and shine and patina, and it will show thumbprints and stuff on it. So it has a feeling of life and vigor that I just love. And these are, I cut them with a plasma arc cutter. And this is a this is a Orchid Dress, and I made them tall. They're about 7 feet high. Most of them are around 7 feet high. And I did that because being a short woman, I've always had to look up to men, like literally. So I took the same proportion, 5'2" to 5'8", sort of small woman, average man, and then I took that same proportion to figure out how high he should be, because I wanted men to look up to these dresses in the same proportion as I was looking up to men. And they're still being shown, which I'm quite pleased about. This is the root dress, and it's really, I didn't think of it at the time, but I realized later that it's a self-portrait, where the outside edges are all kind of jiggly and growing and exploring, but there's this inner core, the root. I come from an agricultural background. My parents were the first generation off the farm in Ontario. So I feel a connection to that, and I think it's partly why I love being in Winnipeg, because it's agricultural. Any questions about the steel dresses? Did I go through too quickly? Okay. After my master's, I was invited to come and teach at Western, and after that, I got a job for 1 year teaching at Grenfell campus in Newfoundland. So this is a picture of how beautiful Newfoundland is, and it's like this everywhere. I didn't pick out the best place to take a picture of. It's just, you could go to the next cove over and it'd be just as beautiful. And I ended up in Newfoundland right after my father was killed in a bicycle accident. He was riding his bike from Miami to Vancouver Island to visit my brother. And he was a bit of an eccentric. He had done a cross-country trip before from Montreal to Mexico. So I thought, oh, no problem, he'll make it. But he didn't. He was killed in central United States. So I arrived in Newfoundland mourning the death of my father. And I noticed, look, this cemetery right here on this beautiful, beautiful landscape. So the dead have the best view in Newfoundland, and the dead are not forgotten in Newfoundland. I just became, after I did some mourning about my dad, also knitting happens everywhere, I really got interested in death and mourning and did a lot of work on that. So in Newfoundland really did inspire me to work more in textiles, to go back to textiles again after the steel work. This is called Paul, and every night I would knit these little squares. And it was kind of that activity. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience of having a death that you're mourning and you have to do something with your hands. It makes you feel alive. It's work that will never be finished. You're deferring death through work and doing something positive. And I learned that it's a communication with the dead. I learned from Newfoundland that when people die, it's a big hole. It's a hole in the community, it's a hole in your life, and you have to fill that with something. So, and you want to keep communicating. Just because they're dead, you still love them. So people buy teddy bears, they put things at the grave, they place flowers in public. So all these activities are ways of communicating. But the dead don't talk back, but doesn't mean we can't keep talking to them. This is a hand-knit bandage that I found in Montreal. Bandages used to be hand-knit for soldiers, which is amazing. And then this was a little practice square I found with it, so that's the model for the little squares I did. And then on the beach in Newfoundland, I saw white quartz stones that just shone. Just the light through quartz is quite amazing. And I knew I had to collect them and make a work about my father. So in that case, the materials came first before the idea. So as art students, you've probably had that experience where sometimes you get an idea first, that's what I'm going to paint. Sometimes you see the material first, you go, oh my God, I love this, what am I going to do with it? And that's how I felt about the stones. So this is Cluster, Oriole, and Nebula. They belong to the rooms now, which makes me really happy because the materials are Newfoundland. So this is how oh wait, I've got a red dot. I feel so professional. This is Cluster, this is how I conceive of the moment of death, and then aureole is that empty space the dead leave behind, and then nebula is where my father is now, out in some kind of space in the stars. In Newfoundland, people decorate the graves, and they decorate the graves sometimes for over 100 years later. It's quite amazing. They have full-page ads in the paper for soldiers who were lost in World War I. So they'll put pictures of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, World War I soldier lost, big. So death is really, you can't allow people to die when when the communities are so close-knit. You have to keep them alive. People talk about the dead in the first person. So this is a particularly beautiful grave that I saw in Rocky Harbor, my favorite harbor. And in this field behind here, the flowers would blow up. The field was full of flowers. And I've been collecting flowers that I find trapped in branches on the outside of cemeteries for years. It's just a weird little collection. Do you have collections as artists? Do you collect things? Something artists do, so don't be shy. Collect things that fascinate you. You never know where it will go. And so I didn't take flowers from the grave, cross my heart, honestly. But except once when they were cleaning the graves for November 1st in Newfoundland, they said they were throwing out all the flowers so I could go, and I was doing white flowers for a particular show. So that was weird to take flowers off. It was weird, but I had permission. Anyway, so I collected lots of flowers, fabric flowers. I took them apart and washed them really, really carefully, and then I laid them out on these torn white, because tearing fabric is grief. It's death and grief when you tear fabric. And so I tore all this white fabric and laid out the flowers in these really compulsive patterns, which I realized later were like my grandmother's quilts. So I call this piece Shroud, and I did it in a lot of different ways. I'll show you other things I did with it. This was a show in England at the Art Gallery at the University of Bath. And the art gallery was this weird kind of L shape with steps and everything. So a preparator and I spent like a week just gluing flowers to the wall. If you can buy water-soluble white glue if you want to glue something to a wall and then take it down, just for artist's material reference. And to remove them, all you do is spritz the fabric flowers. They get kind of damp, and you just smoosh them off the wall. They just fall right off the wall. And the show came back to me in a little box this big. And it was full of a plastic bag full of wet flowers, which I put through the washing machine. Another show in England, I hung them from the ceiling. England, Victorian times, there's a fascination with death, and of course a lot of Newfoundlanders come from England. So these took me ages to make, but they're flowers that are stiffened with white glue, and then they're laid on strings and hung from the ceiling, which took forever. I love that piece. And then I made 2 steel dresses. They're actually shrouds, inspired by a Newfoundland traditional shroud. So these are large steel shrouds about life and death. It's a very simple idea. I'm a teacher, and I tell my students there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's only bad execution. So you can have a simple idea, and we need to hear and see the same things over and over, I believe. Anyway, to me, this is the flowers coming up out of the earth, and then they come around, and then we sink back into the earth. So it's kind of like that circle, natural circle of life and death. There's the detail. So you can see the kind of burning around the edge. This particular sheets of steel I got were a little bit different, and they made this kind of brown burning around the edge. This is the Newfoundland Shroud that I used as inspiration for the work, where flowers are cut out of an ordinary bed sheet. And this is what the dead would be wrapped in. And they were used up until the 1950s. And the reason there's one above ground and not in the ground, I think it's the only one in the world, is that the woman who made it, she was the shroud maker for the community, which was Salvage, Newfoundland, And she made one for herself in her 60s, which is where I am now. I'm in my 60s. And she was in her 60s, made her own shroud because she knew how, because she didn't want to put her sister to all the trouble. Well, she went on to live another over 30 years. May I be so lucky. And so the shroud, and by the time she died, it was in, I think, the 1970s, and they had these new fancy coffins with, like, you know, satin lining. So she didn't use the shroud, and that's why we have one. I just love it.
So there's no stitching on that, or is it
Oh.
just holes, or the cuts?
It just cuts. There's no stitching, and this is, and I went to England to the V&A Museum, and there's one row of stitching here where, you know, 2 sheets were stitched together. There's no stitching on the side, that's a fold, and then this is hand stitched together here, that's the salvage of a sheet there, and then it's cut out. And this has to come from England, but I looked everywhere in Ireland, I looked at every textile collection in England, I looked all over the place, trying to find a precursor for this, and I couldn't find one. But I did find a lot of shrouds in England at the V&A Museum that were cut with pinking shears, and they were cut in very similar designs. So there is a kind of visual history for this. And I just wish I had a PhD in textiles. I would just jump into this head first.
So where is this one now?
This one is in the Fisherman's Museum in Salvage, Newfoundland. And it was on a bed, and it was a bed where little kids would come up and they'd jump on the bed, and it was like, oh my God, this is so precious textile. So I talked the guy who put a piece of string across the bed so kids couldn't jump on the bed anymore. And I'm talking to the rooms, trying to get them to collect this for posterity because it's so precious. It's really hard sometimes to make textiles precious to other people, and I just do my damnedest. Okay, then I've had a couple of residencies. This is the Canada Council, this is Paris, and the Canada Council, wrong button. This is Cité des Arts Internationaux, right here, and it's like 500 studios for artists. So I think you can, when you are further along in your career after you graduate, this is a fabulous residency. They pay you to be in Paris, I think it's 3 months altogether. And I got this studio, and I was honest with them, and I said, what I want to do is knit. And I want to study knitting, and I want to, study wool, and I want to knit. And they gave it to me in 1998. So I was so grateful to Canada Council for being so forward-thinking to support an artist who knits. It was really great. So this is what happened out of that residency. So I think residencies are just fabulous. And I had thought about knitting a landmine when I was in Ottawa, and I heard on the radio that Ottawa in Canada initiated the Landmine Treaty. And because I had knit a rifle before for Kim Campbell in pink, as a thank you for the Gun Control Act. So I thought, I'll knit a line. And in Canada, it didn't make any sense. I thought, that's a stupid idea. So listen to me. When you are in your studio or walking around and you have an idea and you think, oh, that's a stupid idea, that is a little sensor in your head. So just tell that sensor to shut up and go away and leave you alone to do your work. Because if I had listened to that sensor, I never would have done this work. And it was because I was in Paris. And in Paris, I saw signs of war everywhere. There were like holes out of statues. There were bullet holes in buildings. There were plaques for dead soldiers. There were plaques for soldiers that got injured. There's a soldier he was injured in that location. So I was really, really inspired, and I don't know if I'd slide of the Pyramid of Shoes. Maybe it's next. And I went to an event there that really inspired me. So these are some landmines that I've made. There's about 350 different kinds. So the more I learned about it, the more shocking they became to me. If you're wondering how I find out about landmines, there is a book called Jane's Mines and Mine Clearance that you can buy, so that you can actually buy landmines. They're probably selling them on the internet now. And in the back of the book, they have landmine clearing equipment. And I thought, what a great business. You sell people stuff to, kill people, and then you sell them the stuff to clean it up. Oh, it drives me crazy. Anyway, and then somebody in the States, I don't know who, sent me a CD that the American soldiers use in the field. And this is an image from the CD. And so this has all the spec sheets, and I can click on this and zoom in. And this shows, and if I go down here, it will tell me how the landmine works, which sometimes you do not want to know. It tells you what country made it, which is sometimes really shocking. For example, Sweden makes a lot of landmines. The size, so I can get the size right. How to dispose of it. So this is what soldiers use in the field. So I don't know who sent it to me. It was pretty nice. And what I've done lately with landmines is I made an IED, which is what Canadian soldiers had to deal with in Afghanistan. This is not what all the IEDs look like, but it's like one kind. And this is 2 saw blades between 2 pieces of plywood wrapped in plastic. And it would be sealed up here. And this is placed on the road, just under the dirt a little bit. And then when a truck drives over it, I went to the War Museum, and some guys there showed me, as not a real one, but they get Canadian soldiers to actually make them so that they learn. So this was a fake one that was made by a Canadian soldier to learn about how they work. And the 2 saw blades touch, so they're 2 pieces of metal, which makes a current go through here to the detonator, which goes here. Is this the detonator? And then it goes here, and this is a Russian bomb that will go off, and this is a plastic bag. This is me knitting a plastic bag. I have to get better at knitting plastic bags. But no, it wasn't a plastic bag. It was, I think, a burlap sandbag. So that would be, so that's how they work. You didn't want to know that. The work with anti-personnel work that was knitted landmines, accurate replicas of them, led me to thinking about the body of the soldier. And I think more as we were involved in Afghanistan, I was thinking about this, where actual Canadians were dying there. So this is a little piece of magic that I did, and each of the shapes of the camouflage, it's American camouflage and not Canadian. Oh, if I did this with Canadian camouflage, I'd still be doing it, still be at work. But each of the shapes has a chain stitch in different colors of pink thread around it as a kind of protection, and I saw those shapes as territories. And it's actually artists that do these patterns, and the patterns are based on nature. So that really bothers me that nature is being used for such terrible purposes. Anyway, this was about protecting the soldier's body, and I know a soldier. There's the detail. Well, I know a few now, so you can see the embroidery. This is Ricky Hillemeyer, and we lived in the States. This is the love story part. Just as you're getting a little bored, there's the love story. This is Ricky Hillemeyer, and he was my first boyfriend when I was like 14 years old, 15 years old in the United States. And his older brother was fighting in Vietnam. And they had a map in the kitchen of Vietnam with a little kind of red string that went from all, as soon as they got a letter, they would add to the string, which I just love this, a little textile road in red of where the brother was fighting in Vietnam. And Ricky, who was 15 by the time when we moved back to Canada, partly because of the Vietnam War. I have 3 younger brothers, and I'm pretty sure my dad didn't want them going to Vietnam or getting drafted. And shortly after we moved to Canada, a few years after that, sure enough, the Americans did start drafting young Canadians who were living in the States. Anyway, Ricky's my first love, and I still love him. And of course, he's so beautiful, he's so nice. And he wanted to go to Vietnam and help his brother fight. And the passion for, what do you call it when people are loyal to their country? There's a name for that. Patriotism. The passionate patriotism is just unbelievable. And so I had to go back to Canada. We lost touch. And every once in a while I would think about Ricky, and I'd think, did he go to Vietnam? What happened to him? Did he get, and I would well up I would well up. His little 14-year-old body was so beautiful, as 14-year-olds are. He was so beautiful. I couldn't even have, if he'd lost a fingernail, I would have been devastated. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it was just so, and that gave me the idea of the preciousness of the male body. We have this idea women shouldn't fight, but then we throw men at war like their bodies aren't worth anything. And I know as like a heterosexual woman, the male body can be really beautiful, is worth an amazing amount to the people that love that person. I can't imagine what mothers go through. Because I couldn't even call him, I couldn't find out, and it took me 20 years, there is an end to the story, it took me 20 years to figure out, to feel strong enough to call Ricky, and I thought I can handle it. I'm in my 30s now, I can handle this. And I called him, and he's fine. So I know you're all worried. What happened to Ricky? What happened was he signed up the minute he was 18 to go fight in Vietnam. He went through basic training, and he was stationed in Alaska, ready to fly to Vietnam. And he told me on the phone, they canceled the war. What a word to use, like a TV show. Canceled. Not, we lost the war. Canceled the war. And I said, I'm so glad. I was so relieved. I'm so glad you didn't. And he said, I'm not. He said, I will always regret not fighting for my country. So that's the Americans. So I worked with camouflage in my okay, I'll finish up quickly. So these are some more pieces I've done with camouflage, cutting out the fabric and leaving just the seams, which leaves kind of like, feels like bones. And they're uniforms from many, many different countries that I've collected. And then I'm showing you different iterations so that you can see how an artist, you take the same idea, the same work, the same materials even, and do different installations. And so every time I do an installation, I do something different, and it's challenging and interesting. And I've done one where there was like an ocean wave, and then this one, I wanted it to be like a hillside. And this is in Mexico. You remember this, and Mindy remembers this. Yeah, I showed with Mindy in Mexico, and this was a smaller piece where they start disappearing. I think that was Mindy's idea. I think you gave me that idea. Anyway, artists do work together and help each other, so I like that. And then I took the strips of the fabric and I did a piece called Rain. And I realized with this work that I'm doing pieces that are about nature. So what I'm doing is taking the camouflage fabric and trying to return it to nature. And so this has brought me back to nature, which I really like. I live in Newfoundland, and I think what's in your peripheral environment, what you see all the time, really influences you. So I've been very influenced by nature in Newfoundland and coming back to that. So my art practice now is one that's smaller scale and more gentle. I have a few, this is a detail. You could walk right through it and you would be in the middle of this rain of war and not be able to see anything. So this is what I've been doing lately. I'm doing a bunch of different things, but this is my focus now. I have an apron to show you. I brought one, so I will show you because I'm almost finished. This is an installation I do with aprons, and they're vintage ones, of course, and some of them are fake. This is the bison apron. This is little bisons here. This is kitty cat apron, and I don't see any other fake ones, but there's a bunch of fake ones in here. And I've started.
What do you mean by fake?
Yeah.
This ones I've made
Oh.
to look like vintage ones. So when you look at the wall, they all look like vintage, but then when you get up close, you see an apron that's made out of fabric with a little businessmen in their underwear. And so it's a kind of subversive interjection into this world of domesticity. And this is the wrestler's apron, a detail of the wrestler's apron. So, and the waistband of the wrestler's apron looks like those belts that wrestlers get. So I'm just kind of playing with the ideas of masculinity and femininity. So my work does turn around again and again into these circles. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the actual vintage aprons like this one, and I'm embroidering text on them. And this is the last thing that Emily Carr wrote in her diary on the last day of her life. And I find it so inspiring. She wrote, carry on, carry on, carry on. So that's how, this is something that inspires me. And I'm doing a whole bunch of these aprons with different text. Do you want to see the one I'm working on? I can go get it. I'll be right back. I wanted to show this to you as a way of trying to convince some of the art students to come to the textile side because this is my studio. I can take my studio with me anywhere. It's the best ever, especially after doing these great big steel things. So this is a little bag with thread and scissors and needles. And then, so it can sit on the train or on a plane, now that they allow scissors. So, this is a vintage apron. There. And I print out on my computer the text in different fonts, and then I pin it to the fabric, and then I embroider. Oh, I don't have one, I finished 2 words already. And then I embroider chain stitch right on top of that. And this one, some of them are feminist, this one is. It says, I am tired of being scared, which is exactly how I feel at this age. So I'm making a whole series of these. Thank you. I think I've left like 5 minutes for questions before 1 o'clock. I know some of you have to go to classes. Do you have questions? Comments? Things to yell at me?
How do you feel about when you're appropriating textiles, these materials which have existed in the world and have had a life of their own, and then you're interacting with your own person and your own life experiences? How do you feel about that blending process?
I'm not sure if I'm always doing the right thing, of course, but I just love that the uniforms were already worn. I washed them. I don't know why. Washing is a big part of my art practice. I think it's trying to make the world a better place, washing all these things, cleaning things. So I wash them and then cut them up and I save everything. I save the little bits of thread that fall on the floor. It's that Jewish idea, which I didn't know about at the time, but I learned about later when I told somebody this is what I do. It's the fabric, the uniforms, it's a stand-in for a human body. So it's like a human body. So I lose all these little bits and I gather it up. And apparently in the Jewish religion, there's people specialized trained people that come in after there's been a bombing. And they pick up all the little bits of flesh and they keep all to keep the body together. You don't want to lose any little bits of the body. So that's how I feel about the fabric that I'm working with. And I see stains in the fabric that an individual had. I find little things in the pockets. I got for free boxes and boxes of the uniforms that the Canadian soldiers wore in Bosnia that were threadbare. And I know as a textile artist, this was cotton polyester. And the cotton wore away and all that was left was sheer polyester. A woman soldier who had to wear this told me that they had to wear something underneath because you could see their bras right through it, so there's gender involved in this as well. So I made a large piece. I cut out these pieces and made a large piece where there's one for each soldier that died in Afghanistan, and I cut out that little flower from the shroud. And I thought of sending them to the families, but it's too much of an invasion, so the rooms wants it donated. So yeah, it's very strong when you use used clothing. That is strong. There's the presence of somebody there. When people go to the exhibition and they see that piece, it's called fodder, all those uniforms, and they find out they're already worn uniforms, it adds, I think it adds something to the content that actual soldiers wore this. It is, yeah, it's, I am appropriating. I think appropriating is the right word. And I just kind of hope, same with the landmines, I just kind of hope that, I'm appropriating issues of war, I'm working with issues of war, and I'm just hoping that what I do, the positive aspects of what I do sort of outweigh anything where I might be, stepping outside my own personal experience. I've never been in a war zone. I can't. I thought about being people said, oh, you work with war, you should be a war artist, you should go to Afghanistan. The only thing I could think of to do in Afghanistan, I would sit in the middle of the Canadian compound and just cry all day. And that's not going to help anybody. That's the only thing I would be so upset. They don't want an upset artist. So I can't say anymore that I'm from a country that hasn't experienced war. We've experienced war. I experienced the results of war by living in the United States and knowing Ricky. And that was just a tiny, tiny little drop in a thimble of what people who really experience war must go through. But just going through that little bit was like a bit of an insight. Good question. Have I worn you out?
No, but it's interesting how you talk about appropriation, and just bouncing off of John's question here, because, a few decades ago, that was the thing for artists to do, appropriation art, right? And they would get in trouble. And Sherry Levine was copying pictures of Walker Evans, etc. And in fact, the idea, I think, at the time was somehow had something to do with artists always borrowing, and that was at the core of their practice.
Yes.
Right? That you look at other things and that you somehow incorporate it into what you're doing yourself. Mm-hmm. And that also, it was the age of the death of the author, right?
Yes.
And that there was no such thing as any kind of originality anyways.
Yeah, we're
right?
just a voice of the
but
culture.
But now
and
that
conduct.
word has become quite fraught. Mm-hmm. Yes? And I can hear it in the way you're talking about it as well. What right do I have to be using these symbols and icons or this material?
Yes.
And you're very careful about it now.
Yeah, when I didn't wear a uniform myself. Although with the landmines, I do that work because of the devastation they bring to soldiers and more to women and children. A great number of landmines affect women and children and animals. If you're a farmer and you have an oxen and it loses a leg because of a landmine, you are poverty-stricken, you're not a farmer anymore, you're devastated. You have to put your daughter into prostitution or something. It's just like, it's a different relationship with animals than we have. So but I think I'm a Northern Hemisphere person, and most of the landmines are made in the Northern Hemisphere, and that's who I'm talking to. I'm talking to the United States. Sign the Ban Mine Treaty already, So I love showing the landmines in the United States, because it's just like, you guys, you got to catch up here. You got to get on the ball and stop these. But Americans won't sign that treaty. So they still use and develop. They develop really horrible, horrible ones. And I'm appropriating here too. I'm appropriating Emily Carr's words. But when it's exhibited, there's going to be a little card saying Emily Carr's words. I'm giving her credit for it. And I think as I get older, I don't quite care as much anymore. So it's Emily Carr's words. I'm taking them, spreading them around. I hope it's okay, Emily Carr. I love your work. So, yeah.
Because you can think of it as an homage.
It is an homage. Yes, that's why I picked, the green apron and the green, and I changed. These are lots of different colors of green that I changed, and it's an homage. Yeah. But I have many different sources of text. I'm not a writer, so I find text, I hear it, I steal it. So email me. If you've got a pithy little bit of text that you think might look great on an apron, send it to me. I will steal it, I will use it and put it on an apron and send you a picture of the apron.
Well, if there are no more questions or comments, I'm sure Barb would be available for more intimate conversations, and thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed being here. And if you can email me, so I don't mind being emailed. It's barbhunt@gmail.com. So if you think of something later, think, oh, I want to ask her this or wonder about that, just send me an email. So I'm open to that.
Thank you.
Okay? I've got to pack up the studio now. Oh, this was so great. I wish I'd done this my whole life.
It's true, right? It's true.
Oh, good. No, I was showing you the way I intended it, which was streams of rain filling up the gallery space. That was the way I visualized it. But then at the rooms, they had lights and all kinds of crazy. So I had to build this circular. But it turned out okay. I liked it. People could walk through it. Yeah, but I wanted people to actually touch more. I wanted I should have said that was John's question. I want other people to actually touch. So I was actually
I feel that even after you watch it.
maybe not so much, but the presence is there. And you?